Christopher Alexander, whom I know only slightly, has had an enormous critical influence on my life and work. And I think that's true of a whole generation of people. I think that for me, it began on the second floor of the library of the Graduate School of Design at Harvard when I was looking for something else, and I ran across an essay by this person, Christopher Alexander, called "The City is Not a Tree." That was a landmark moment in my development as a thinker and as an architect. It really blew away what were the foundational principles of the education at Harvard in those days. And it established in me an interest in actually looking at the world and not looking at a set of preconceived, abstract, mechanical ideas that were supposed to replace the existing world.
Chris's scholarship, in fact, has been his criticism by his proposals implicating and critiquing contemporary practice. The inclination to focus beyond the individual building on placemaking that might, in fact, please its users, a kind of radical idea.
It made me think about how can you break a project down into requirements, is what he called them. Rooms should face a certain direction, or there should be wind protection, or whatever the thing was. And like everybody, I think, of my generation, I bought those books. And I went on and did other things, and it all came back to me when I was building my own house. I realized at one point, I think it was because I had placed a window somewhere, and I realized you couldn't see anything through that window, and it really should be a little bit lower and a little bit over here, and then you had a nice view out. And somehow the patterns started falling into place. But all the patterns were actually there. They sort of came out naturally. And even the one about sleeping facing a certain direction, that was the way our bed sort of turned out. And it was the thing that I think convinced me totally, that experience of the correctness, the sort of fundamental correctness of his vision.
His idea that you make places that people appreciate, that people love, might be the formula for the ultimate sustainability, in which you make places that people, in participating in making and in their beauty, will want to save.
I don't think I'm saying anything controversial to anyone here tonight when I observe that in the last century, we humans have begun to make a very worrisome mess of our planet. And of course, a lot of this has to do with the ways that we've chosen to build our world. And for many people, there's a growing perception that the manifest sustainability of this state of affairs is in some perhaps deep and important way connected to the growing ugliness of the world that we're building. So I think one reason that Christopher Alexander's work strikes such a strong emotional chord for so many people is that he took up this challenge a long time ago, and he offered a very humane vision of a more hopeful alternative. He reminded us of the beautiful and harmonious places that we are capable of achieving and have achieved, and he offered some ideas about how to achieve them again in a way that's likely to be much more sustainable and more beautiful.
That's wonderful. Would you like your tea? Is this yours?
Yeah.
Oh God, it's cold. Would you like a hot tub? Yeah. Okay. I think I'm going to make myself some. I've got some water here. That's fine.
Now it's rolling very hard.
Really, one of the very largest problems that is facing the Earth just now is rarely mentioned, and that is the spread of ugliness. By the standards of the 20th century, it sounds like a sort of rather trivial and unimportant issue. It's not. It's on the same scale as the alarm that was spread when people began to realize that the Brazilian rainforest was being destroyed. 9 out of 10 development projects that are being done now devastate the area where they're built. This is going on at a colossal speed, and no amount of planning and architecture in the current way of thinking is going to save it. In fact, if anything, architects are contributing to it by making their particular contributions more and more fantastic, so that they can be on the cover of magazines. The real issue is something that I call adaptation, and that means the extent to which all the little bits, whether it be of a building or of a sidewalk or of a staircase or anything, can only be made right if it is done slowly and with care and by people who know the immediate vicinity. And the number of actions that are needed to take care of a piece of the environment and get that kind of beautiful, subtle fine-tuning of the alignment of streets and the width of a road at a certain place and the preservation of a tree in a certain place where it would otherwise be taken down, and so on. We urgently and desperately need to find a way of doing this which is consistent with our 21st century world. So what is the nature of order all about? It took 25 years to write, 4 big fat books or big thick books. Unfortunately a little expensive, about $60 a book. Thousands of lovely colored pictures. Anyway, what's it all about? When I finished the pattern language, I thought that I had come close to solving the problem of making good human environments, and that if people went to work and used all those patterns, something very beautiful and good would follow in the hands of ordinary people, and just from the use of that language, that pattern language. That turned out to be not true. The early experiments that I made after the book came out, the pattern language book came out, I made it over a period of years. I made experiments to see what happened when people actually used this, and yes, certainly things, I think people did things that were very, very helpful to them, and some of them are quite lovely just in the sense of being informal and being about that person or this person or that place and so forth. But the buildings and the groups of buildings and so forth were not really beautiful, to put it quite simply. They weren't. Luckily, I was, at that time, still relatively early in my professional life, and so I had time to think about this. And what the nature of order is about is, what does it take to make the things beautiful? really and truly beautiful in the old-fashioned meaning of the word, so that it touches you in your heart. And what these books attempt to do is to describe what is involved in thinking about that, what's involved in doing it, what's involved from a practical point of view in terms of construction, contracting, and so forth, what's involved from a spiritual point of view, so that you, as the maker, whoever that is, are in a sufficiently harmonious state to be able to make a beautiful thing. So it's really the gamut of all of that is what these books are about. I certainly got closer in those books than I did in the pattern language, a lot closer.
I've come to the conclusion that in order to set our ideas about architecture straight, and in order really to establish a clear picture of what we're doing when we build, it's necessary to make changes in our conception of how the physical universe is put together. That actually the order of space is prior to the issue of function. That is, in other words, although functional issues are overwhelmingly important, the root matter has to do with order in space, and that there are ways of getting hold of that issue which are so deep that they cover the functional issues, but they turn out to be more fundamental. And in fact, they have the ornamental stuff and the formal stuff as byproducts of them. But that structure, by the way, this structure that I want to talk about is not very obscure. I mean, I can easily put a name on it. I can call it wholeness if you want. We can call it many things. And I'm going to show some examples of physical things that have this deep kind of wholeness in them. And then we'll just talk a little bit about what sort of structure they have. Can we say anything about what these structures are? Can we be explicit about it at all? I, after thinking carefully about this for a number of years, been able to identify somewhere around about a dozen, something between a dozen and 15 different structural properties that repeatedly exist. Now, of course, it remains to be discussed and argued whether these deep structures are important or not. when one discovers 12, 15 properties of a certain sort, which are structural properties that appear to characterize a class of structures, then you say to yourself, well, what is going on? What are these properties? I mean, where do they come from? What's the meaning of them? And quite simply, the conclusion that I've come to, I don't know if it's the right way to explain it, is that they are essentially the different ways in which space can be glued together to become whole. If it's true that space has the capacity to be more whole or less whole, and there are real structural properties that have the capacity to glue it together more or less, both in a functional sense and in a deep sense, I mean, then of course in some way one would start to confront a kind of moral imperative that that is what we're supposed to be doing when we make something, to glue space together like that. Of course, another very important question that you ask is, well, how do you produce something which has this unity of space or this kind of wholeness or this glued together quality? How do you actually go about making something like that?
The number of actions that have to, if I take an area, let's say, for the sake of argument, 100 square meters by 100 square meters, 1 hectare or 2 acres. The number of adaptations that need to be made is somewhere on the order of about somewhere between 1 and 10 billion. 10 billion little tweaks that have to do with pushing this stone that way, opening up that window that much, making the slope of that particular roof be like that, and so on and so forth. That's a ferocious number. And it's not just the number in and of itself, because it can't be done in a computerized form far away from the place, because then you haven't got the real data to work with, and you don't see the whole that exists, and therefore you don't know what adaptations are needed in order to make every little bit just right. So this is something that's got to be done in the field. So that means we have to conceive a process in which that 100 meters by 100 meter area is able to take 11 billion actions and to do it in a reasonable time with a reasonable kind of cost. Our lack of ability to do this is essentially what has been destroying the world for the last 100 years or so. It was commonplace before that. It always was taking place. It took place very, very slowly. And it was always people who were intimately familiar with. Are you all right? Intimately familiar with the place where it had to be done. We have no idea how to do that. First of all, the process of making controlling the process of design, construction, planning, and detailing has been removed already from the site, almost entirely. So what is, in order to solve this problem, a really gigantic change in the steps we go through to make the environment on a daily basis. And that's really the challenge that we face at the moment. It's a far greater challenge than the so-called sustainability issue of putting energy, finding energy by sustainable means. I mean, that's a very, very important problem. But it's a trivially easy problem compared with the problem that I've just described. And we need to set our minds to work on this problem. It has huge ramifications, of course. I mean, you can see that it affects building contracts, it affects the nature of subcontracts, it affects the nature of specifications, it affects planning law, it affects the politics of neighborhoods, and because what it implies is that the overall distribution of control is to be utterly altered. It's a completely benign transfer of control to the people who actually know what to do and who will be able to take it on relatively easily. But wresting that control from government agencies and from the large architectural and engineering firms and so on is a huge undertaking. And of course, what is needed in order to make it happen is not just some sort of battle with large, cumbersome institutions. We need to visualize in practical detail the kind of process that can make this happen.
You were talking before about the ugliness, the increasing ugliness of the world, and that this is not just a sort of psychological issue, a peripheral issue. It's actually telling us something ecologically profound.
Right.
And And then in talking about nature of order, and talking about the issue of beauty, the same thing is true, isn't it? That it's not simply about, well, I would like to be in the presence of beautiful things. Yes, you would, but the reason you would like to be in the presence of beautiful things is that you are well, and they are well.
Exactly.
And
yes, very well put.
Right. So that's why I think people are getting very interested. The more perceptive ecologists and environmental thinkers and activists and others are getting more interested in the nature of order. Is that it addresses that dimension, and I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit and your thoughts. What was your aim, and what you see as its role in thinking more ecologically about our age and how we live, and what we need to do to be well, as you put it.
Well, I think it is true that people are in a state of tremendous unease. I mean, tremendous internal unease. It doesn't matter how many fast cars you've got and how many exotic vacations you can take with Ryanair or somebody else. This is not going to bring to you what you want of life, and I think yes, people are beginning to realize that, and I think they're aching for it. Actually, I mean, it's an amazing and sobering discovery to make, you know, when we're so affluent and when people feel that everything is sort of okay. It's sort of gradually beginning to get into people's minds that this is a serious problem. I mean, it's not as if it hasn't been in people's minds before, because after all, Jung and Freud lived almost 100 years ago, and they opened up avenues that also had to do with this sort of thing, and trying to help people cope with their inner life and actually bring their inner life into a state that would make them truly well. So it's been around for a long time. I suppose I'm one of the I suppose you could say I was a pioneer, really, to say to people, look, the shape of the environment, the buildings, the rooms, the gardens, all these things are directly connected to the degree to which a human being can compose himself or herself, and in which a group of people can be together under deep and valuable circumstances. It can't be separated from the environment. I think at one time people thought that it was separate. I can remember when I was a student back then, there was a lot of talk going on about what did the environment actually influence behavior and so on, and it was being asked always in a very silly, sort of mechanical way, to which the proper answer was no. Because obviously human beings are not automata, and the environment isn't going to kind of push me, pull you into being something or other thing. But nevertheless, I think I've shown innumerable ways how a person's well-being is dependent on the geometric and practical organization of things at the tiny scale like that, and big scale, and gigantic scale of kilometers, miles, what have you. That's what the nature of order is about. It's about all of that stuff. And I think people should pay attention to it.
There were several strands in there that I want. How do you like this format, by the way?
I like it.
Okay.
I think it's fun.
Yeah.
I'm enjoying it.
You're talking about the 1960s and 50s when you were active in writing your first book, Notes on the Synthesis of Form, and there was this notion of functionalism, which was not about aesthetics, or if aesthetics was involved, it was more a matter of sort of information processing. And it seems to me what you have really, in your career, taken from that point, you've built on it, but you've said, actually aesthetics, in the sense of our ability to perceive wholes and to perceive beauty, which is a kind of wholeness. I mean, that's, wouldn't you say,
Yes.
that's what beauty really is? And that actually you can have a science of that, and you can have an art of that, and you can build your life around that kind of understanding, and that actually that's what we had better do. You said at one point, to be well, we must set our sights on such a future, and so I guess that what I'm interested to hear you discuss is how you think your ideas on that have changed since the days when you were in Cambridge, England, and Cambridge, Massachusetts, and what to me is the most, personally, perhaps the most fascinating part of your work, which is the relationship between structure and meaning or quality, which is intimate, you've shown. And how do you see that? Where are you in that process now?
Can you say a little bit more before I try to answer?
Sure.
Because I don't, I mean, of course I get the general gist of the question, but if you could just sharpen the question a little bit.
Okay. There's a in philosophy and mathematics, there's a whole field of structuralism and an understanding of how particularly linguistic structures work, but other structures. And left out of that equation up until now, really, has been, but also sort of lurking in the background and causing all kinds of problems, is value and meaning. And it seems to me that's been a core focus of your work all along.
Always, yes. Absolutely.
And what have you done in the nature of order to develop that thread further? Because to me it has it's been a central aim. Am I right?
Yeah. Oh, yes, you are. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Well, referring specifically to the nature of order, you see, it's very, very difficult to deal with the nature of order properly without talking about God. I lectured on the nature of order for years, wrote the books. Most of that time I myself did not speak about God. I very, very rarely so much as mentioned that subject in the lecture room. I think there was a certain sense that it was inappropriate. And I'm embarking now on a view of the world where the question of what is the nature of God can be discussed, thought about, considered critically. One doesn't need to make exaggerated statements about it. One doesn't need to believe in visitations from the Virgin Mary. One does need to consider what is the nature of wholeness in the universe and what are the conditions under which wholeness grows. What is wholeness? And the answers to that straightforward question cannot be given by mechanistic thought modes. So the problem is, I mean, there is this thing of how the greater whole works. And as I say, I'm personally quite convinced that it cannot be subjected to analysis by primitive mechanism. On the other hand, I'm also convinced that it can be approached through rational, even mathematical thought. It deals with real phenomena, and as I say, these phenomena gradually, what shall I say? They gradually sort of go in transition towards touching such questions as the nature of God. And you may say, well, but what if God doesn't exist? What if this is all hoo-ha? Well, the point is that there are these phenomena of wholeness, which is the most important of all of them. If you rule out forms of explanation, even observations of certain kind of phenomena, and do not allow yourself to tell, as far as you can, the exact truth about what is going on in these cases, but only allow those things to be said which can be handled in a mechanistic framework, at this point you're simply doing bad science. I mean, it's not, you can't do Science has to do with knowing, knowledge. And so there's this huge gray area, and it's which doesn't so much have to do with spooks and poltergeists. It has to do with very fascinating things about how the whole acts, and how at the moment, for instance, there's been a belief in the last decade or so that you can understand how the whole behaves as a result of complex interactions between many particles, or if you want to view some complex system as a cellular automaton, that by in effect programming the way that the different cells interact in that cellular automaton, one can hope to realize the behavior of something in a holistic fashion. Now, there's a severe limitation on that. It is true that some apparently holistic phenomena can be simulated like that and can be reached like that, but there are other far greater issues where the whole is acting, where at the moment there is absolutely no probability in sight of being able to explain them in that simple-minded way. And yet, if we're dealing with such topics as you were raising a little while ago about people's well-being and so forth, the wholeness that is necessary to make a human being deeply grounded and at one with the world around, that is not within the reach of mechanistic explanations. But it is not only a subtle, but also a very important problem which needs to be tackled head-on by whatever means it takes to come to terms with it. And in The Nature of Order, going back to that book for a moment, I laid some of the first steps of a path that goes in that direction. And as I said, I'm now embarked on a series of new books, about 7 or 8 of them, which will try to complete the journey and actually make clear how all this necessarily fits together.
You mentioned the problem of compartmentalization, and you pointed out that really that's bad science, because ultimately you can't compartmentalize. You might get a nice, it might be a nice trick for a while, but sooner or later you've got to start integrating these areas of knowledge. And isn't that what you're saying when you're talking about God, that we have compartmentalized under this category of God all the things that have to do with the wholeness of life, the meaning of life, the beauty of life, the divinity of life, and trivialized it in a way by saying, well, that's just something that's over in the corner. And
It's
go ahead.
No, you're quite right. I think that kind of compartmentalization is drastically dangerous, and it's. I mean, the idea that it's okay to do physics, but that God has to be kept behind closed doors, is ludicrous in view of if you think about the very extraordinary proposals that are currently being made in contemporary physics, they're more far out in many ways than any religious thought ever was. There is absolutely no reason to erect that sort of barrier. And it's really just a pretense. It's based on wishful thinking about what you can do with mechanistic explanations. And I think to this day, a lot of scientists can't quite go there. That is, they would like to pursue the explanations of the phenomena they encounter, but they restrict plausible or acceptable explanations to those that can be formulated in a mechanistic way. And of course, the issue is very important, is, well, okay, how can you formulate a rational explanation in a non-mechanistic way? And what does that look like? That's once again one of the things that I'm taking up in these books that are now in preparation.
The suppression of this realm of life, or this compartmentalization, it seems to me, is coming back to haunt us in many ways. For example, you talked about Islamic fundamentalism, and we had talked before about the fact that there's clearly a strong motivation that many of the 9/11 terrorists, for example, said. They were, Mohammed Atta was an urban planner who was outraged at the destruction of Aleppo, Syria, by modern development.
Right.
And that their heritage and their culture and their metaphysical beliefs were being shredded.
Trampled, yeah.
Trampled. And there's that dimension, but it seems to me there's also the dimension of what you talked about earlier, of the sort of lack of satisfaction in our own lives and happiness in our own lives, that we're using so many resources and at such a high level of consumption, and it's not making us any happier. And this is being shown by research that people in there's this wealth plateau where people stop getting any happier, and this is the penny that's got to drop with sustainability too, doesn't it? Because how are we ever going to have an ecological or sustainable way of living if we don't deal with that?
Absolutely, yes, quite.
It says we've got 3 minutes, so...
Okay, you can stop right there.
Yeah. I wonder if you could give us your thoughts about technology and the way that technology is changing. A lot of architects today have try to paint a wonderful picture of the future, that we're all going to live in these wonderful skyscraper cities, and technology is going to save us. We're going to have clean energy and so on. And some of those architects are more perceptive about the biological characteristics of those structures. Some of them are big advocates of biomimicry and biophilia, and they want to say, these structures are more lifelike. What I find fascinating about your work is that you say, no, we don't want technology that's more lifelike. We want technology that is living, that is life. I wonder if you could...
Well, yes, I was just thinking when you started asking about technology, when I told you in that first tape we made about 100 meters by 100 meters area containing some 10 billion smaller holes, that, and those are the ones that are, of course I'm not including molecules and stuff like that. Those are just the ones at the sort of perceivable level where you can touch and recognize. And shaping all of those in such a way that they fit together harmoniously and they really belong together is a gigantic technological task. I mean, in other words, it is, I suppose that it might sound like science fiction to some people. I don't feel that at all. I don't think it's science fiction. I think it is something that will happen, must happen. But the whole question is, what is the nature of the way in which that activity is steered, right? You know, on the one hand, you've got various people who know, perhaps even sort of, you might say every bush, certainly, and blade of grass, and obviously every paving stone. But it's an incredibly subtle form of linkage that is required, where in effect it's a new technology that is needed to allow us to guide that process. And I mean us in the plural, even for a relatively small place. So that the thing is developing in real time. The players, that is the citizens of Earth, are conscious of this as an activity, are aware that it is in their hands and that it's their responsibility to try to make these fine-tuning adaptations. It is actually in their hands to preserve and extend the beauty of that particular place. But the technological fact remains that there are 10 billion entities to be shaped. And it's no good, I mean, 10 billion is 10,000 million. So that is a lot of things to pay attention to and shape them. And so the technology, I'm quite certain it will be computer assisted in some form. It may even get computer assist from the mathematics of structure preserving transformations. But it's so unbelievably different from taking a piece of wood and cutting it into lengths and building a simple fence, where of course we're also doing detailed adaptation to every one of those pieces, and very carefully, if you know, it's not hard to do in the case of a simple fence. It will not be helpful for this to become computerized in the sense of the computer somehow being the surrogate for the actual place or the actual fence. Because I'm absolutely certain that a human being or several human beings need to have their feet planted on the ground and need to be steering that process. On the other hand, because it is so complicated, it will need a huge technological assist. And I don't know right now what is the right way to do that. And we've only just at this moment arrived at a state of play where one could contemplate that question. I mean, now we do have computers that have the capacity to do it. We have innovations in complex system theory, and I think you know that I'm part of a project like that at the University of York, where we can, again, contemplate how this may be done and how people might interact with it. That would be the most spectacular piece of technology, by far outweighing titanium spectacle frames, you know, in terms of how interesting it is or how important it is. I don't think, once this is achieved, I think it will dwarf all other forms of technology in terms of its importance and its use by human beings.
So you're really talking about a step change in how we use technology and how technology interacts with our lives and our living processes and how we understand that. Can you describe that a little bit? You use the phrase structure preserving transformations, and some viewers might not know what that is, and perhaps if you could just give a short summary of that, and then talk about how that work is going on in York with your colleagues there.
Well, these structure-preserving transformations or wholeness-enhancing transformations, they're fundamental to all the adaptation, because when something is well done or well made, it starts with the structure that is there, and then that structure has to be, in a way, corroborated, confirmed by whatever you do there next. So you cannot wade in and just do something arbitrary just because you think it's nice or a good idea. You really, if you are acting in a way that is responsible, you look at the structure that the Earth has at that particular spot, and you try to discern what the thing you wish to do, how it fits and enhances the existing structure that is there, which will be almost certainly include buildings, roads, whatever. I mean, in other words, I'm not talking about nature solely, although the same thing has to be true of nature. And I mentioned a fence a moment ago. I mean, the very first thing you need to do, if you're going to build a fence and adapt it to the land in which it is, of course, you have to be looking at the lie of the land. What is a comfortable and appropriate alignment for that fence? How do you place the fence so that drainage water doesn't puddle around the posts, which will then rot out? You know, so there's a whole and usually you can find something that I call a latent centers, to guide you. In other words, if you know you're going to put in a fence, and then you look for things that are already somehow marked as potentially emergent holes in the land, and you then say, okay, in that case, we'll put a post here, and we'll put a post here, and a post there, and a post over there. And and if that is done, so that indeed the structure of the land that's there when you start is enhanced by the fence, then you have a beautiful fence, and that piece of the world has become slightly more harmonious as a result of that action. And so that's what a structure preserving transformation is, or a wholeness preserving transformation. Yeah.
And the opposite of that approach would be to go to the big box shopping center and buy a post kit, and then take that sort of template and just plop it down, right? And then whatever incidental relationship it has with what's there, well, that's just what you get, and that's sort of the way we've built the modern world, isn't it? I mean,
actually, I need to understand your question more precisely.
right.
Are you talking about a ready-made fence, or are you talking about a sort of kit of posts and runners?
A ready-made fence.
A completely ready-made
Right,
fence.
right.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because you can guarantee that that it won't be quite right in any actual given place.
But this is how we're building.
Absolutely, this is what
This is
people do
When
now.
people criticize, cookie cutter subdivisions,
Yes.
or, but in fact, much of architecture as well is because it is essentially template based, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
And it's rather than adaptive in some rigorous way, and so
That's why they're so gruesome.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And going back to our topic yesterday on aesthetics, the human conscious perceptive system is marvelously able to perceive these qualities and to find things that just don't quite feel right, unsettling, and I mean, I know my colleagues in New Urbanism struggle with this all the time, in part because they do designs that are in many ways quite good, and then they sort of turn it over to the conventional building process, and it's all sort of stamped out in a visual way, and has this unsettling artificial.
Well, I don't think they've actually fully taken the idea on board. I don't think they really understand this idea that I'm speaking about. And I want to emphasize one aspect of it. It sounds somewhat perhaps forbidding with a long name like structure preserving, wholeness enhancing, and so forth. And I also said, that it might well be involving computers, and I'm talking about 11 or 10 million knowable bits and pieces within that 100 by 100 plot. And I think what has to be emphasized is they're gorgeous, aren't they? They're right there now. You just want to swing the camera and take them out. The sun is shining on those yellow breasts.
Gorgeous birds, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, it's all right.
I'll cut to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the thing is that what I've just enunciated is so simple. The idea that each thing has to be fitted to its place in the world is really, of course, it's common sense. It's about the most elementary thing almost that you could possibly say about architecture and towns and so on. And yet, at this moment in history, nobody is doing it to, with the exception, let's say, of 1% of the people, maybe. And it's not even thought about, and yet it's the most dramatically important thing there is. If you just do that one thing, and nothing else, you're almost home there. You're almost home free. It's both tiny in its intellectual compass and absolutely gigantic in its consequences. You know, yeah.
And there's quite an interest now. One of the things I'm very encouraged by is among architecture students, there's a new interest in design, build, and in getting out and actually making things.
Yes.
And isn't that essential to the whole?
It is.
You have to change the process of building.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And that in turn does require a lot of fine details of administration and the flow of money and the decision making along the way as you go, because you discover new things to new adjustments that need to be made. There's just no other way to do it. A lot of people are very interested in your work in computer science, and so I wanted to turn to your work in York and your work in computer science more generally. You're very well known as developing pattern languages, but I think people may not be aware of where you've taken that and where you intend to take that. So I'd be fascinated to hear more about the Cosmos project, your work in York, and how it relates to, you've talked about structure preserving transformations, and how this work is going forward with new computer science.
I'm not sure I'm really ready to speak about it yet. I mean, I'm not shy of speaking about it, but we've only just begun. Essentially what it consists of is that we are trying to build a computer model of wholeness in a given thing, so that one can then see if the computer can be instructed to find the latent centers in a given configuration. I mean, that's very simply the problem. That is what we're exactly attempting to do week by week. We're a long way from getting there. And I remember when how long ago was that? It was about 10 years ago, I think, that I was holding some discussions with Bill Joy, who used to be one of the owners of Sun Microsystems. Well, he was one of the founders, and talked to him about this, and he was tremendously excited about it, and he said, "Okay, fine. Can you really do that?" And I said, "Well, no, not yet. No, we can possibly begin thinking about it, but we can't do it yet." And that was 10 years ago, and that situation has changed now. I'm not going to put a bet on how likely it is that we will succeed in this. Even if we succeed in a rudimentary form, it will be very important. I think for an odd reason, and that is that if we can find algorithms which do that, it's not that process will then be computerized, but more, it will be possible to tell people what the search for the latent centers really is. I mean, if you can tell a dumb machine to do that, then obviously it means that we have to understand it, and there will be a wider understanding of that very, very vital issue, and which will be needed to accomplish the adaptation that I was speaking about.
And there could be all sorts of benefits in terms of cognition and neuroscience, aesthetics, the understanding of how we do this.
Yes, exactly. That's right.
And
also,
that's one of the fascinating things about your career, is the way some of these threads have gone off into different fields and sort of come full circle in a way, and that certainly seems to be happening with computer science now. That you know, you've spawned all of these fascinating things, and now you're sort of bringing it back to your own work on structure-preserving transformations. What do you think? Do you see that this could be potentially a guide for users in laying out a community or
Yes,
that sort of thing?
absolutely. Yes, no doubt about that.
Hard to know ahead of time, isn't it, what the applications could be? But clearly, it's the effort to make.
Well, it's not actually. I mean, in other words, if somebody, it's not hard to identify that. If somebody wants to build 20 houses on a particular piece of land, one of the reasons, you touched on this earlier already, if this was done in the way in which developers normally develop tracts, you know that there's going to be a plan there which is independent of what the land is actually telling it to be. And so, of course, it feels like a gash, no matter if it's done nicely or not. It's still going to be a gash. And if the technology that I've just been referring to becomes available, then immediately there would be tools available for a builder or a planner or a community to say, well, okay, let's pinpoint the key latent centers in this piece of land and let them tell us where the major features of this thing that we're about to build, where they should be and how they should be laid out. I think that'll become as commonplace as sat-nav systems in a car, you know, which, well, 15 years ago it was sort of just barely known as a possibility, and now it's commonplace. So I don't think that that's a particularly long stretch.
What I find fascinating is there's that paper, there's notes on the synthesis of form, there's other writings from around that time by other writers like Jane Jacobs, Death and Life of Great American Cities, all pointing to these flaws in the way cities were being conceived and executed in planning. And here we are almost half a century later, and how much has changed, really?
No.
Not very much.
That's right, not very much. Yeah, it's very scary.
In some ways, perhaps, is this a last gasp of the sort of 20th century industrial approach to making things? But what I find interesting and wonder if you could talk about a little bit is how that process of technology of stamping things out and making things as sort of consumer products, commodities, is creating the crisis that we're in, that at least everyone recognizes we're in a crisis now.
Yes.
Perhaps that's the first
Yes.
positive step in a way.
Right.
And that the chickens coming home to roost about that crisis are going to inevitably lead us in the direction you've been talking about for years, of questioning the whole foundations of this industrial template-based approach.
Well, yes. I mean, either that is going to happen, or we are going to destroy ourselves. It could easily be one or the other.
Yeah.
And it's a bit hard to say. I don't think we really know what it looks like for a civilization to destroy itself. You know, I mean, at the moment, I think the general feeling is that that's something that happened that's something that happened to the other people. It doesn't happen to us, you know. And I think there's a very, very alarming there, and
But at least there is that recognition, as Jared Diamond points out, that we do have the power to recognize what's going on, and then from there we have the capability to do something about it. But in order to do that, it seems to me we have to do what you've argued for years, which is really question the foundation of industrial technology and how humane it really is. And how limited it is in a way. As I think
you know, the difficulty with the whole thing is that the length of the feedback cycle is bad. I mean, in other words, it doesn't bode well, because somebody feels their family's falling apart in an apartment house in Chicago, and the person who's actually experiencing that is not able at the moment to pull any strings that are actually attached to the system that is causing all of this, right? So that the destruction can go on sort of unchecked. And even though people may experience it, and as you say, whatever you said a moment ago, you know, that there's an awareness growing that this is very, very serious stuff, but all the people's awareness of that isn't really capable of pulling any handles to alter the situation. And I'm not sure what the solution to that is, but I think that's actually the problem. Not whether people are becoming aware. I suppose you can say, well, that's a first step. It is a first step. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I feel I may have more to say on this subject, but I don't have right now. I think it would be extremely interesting to get a group of us that are willing to try and think the thing through at that level. But it's a very, very mind-boggling task.
No, 1.5 years.
I'm happy to see you. It's been about a year ago, I think.
Good seeing you.
Good to see you too.
Just make me blush.
It's been a long time since I saw you. It's been
well,
about a year ago, I think. When you were here last.
Si tu veux, Philippe.
Here, this is for you. Wow.
Oh, is that me?
It's been a long time. See how much.
Through the course of 40 years plus, practicing, building some beautiful buildings, how to get CES and the people that have studied and have been influenced by you and your work and what CES has done. How do you get to that larger,
To get that happening on a larger scale.
larger scale?
But we were more talking
Yeah,
that yes, the future of CES
Right.
and how we're going to talk to people.
I think one of the powerful things about a pattern language, and also one of the problems with it, is what really convinces us that we can do this initially is the images in the photographs. Because we look at these and we say, oh my gosh, this actually can happen. And then what actually starts to dissuade us from this is these images are all from really old places. So, to me, the communication issue is how do we show this is happening today?
So what if the technology can reach a point where the technology could integrate the geometric properties?
If you would rely on all these people to help you.
There's all of us and a lot more out there, you know, doing all the things that we're doing.
So thank you very, very much, every single one of you.
Sure.
Good to see you. Good to be here.
And you can watch the whole thing all over.
Oh, God, no.